Welcome everyone. My name is Andrew Dennis and I'm a professor of practice at Michigan State University. I'm part of the game development program housed in the Department of Media and Information. I'm pleased to present you with this course on video game art along with my friend and colleague, the talented Ricardo Guillamares. Together, we'll take you through a series of modules on creating art for video games. Ricardo will be teaching you art fundamentals and how to design interesting assets. I'll show you game art workflow and techniques to take those ideas and put them inside of a game. Maybe you're a programmer or designer and you have a game but you need art for it. Maybe you're a graphic designer or an illustrator and you want to start taking contracts on making art for indie games. Or maybe you finished MSU's Coursera Game Design and Development course and you want to dive deeper into the visuals of games. Either way, our pairing of art and technology will have something for anyone interested in producing visuals for games. Our first module is on pixel art, and here we aim to give you the foundations of art and technology that you'll need to make simple art for your games. By starting with something like pixel art, we can focus on your core skills and knowledge. Future modules will work up to increasingly complex art styles as we introduce more nuanced topics and more complex workflows. The indie game explosion has shown us that game development is for everyone. I'm excited to be part of a course that's designed to put those tools in the hands of anyone who's excited about making games. So, thanks for joining us. I'll see you in the next video. Hi there, Andrew here. In previous lessons with Ricardo, you have learned how to use Photoshop to create concepts and color palettes. Today, I'll show you how to leverage the high-tech tools in Photoshop to create some low-tech game art. This will make creating assets easier for us. Asset is a term we will use to mean any individual piece of art that will ultimately end up in our game. First, we need to create a new document for our first pixel asset. Computers like images to be in powers of 2. It makes them easier and faster to process. So we're going to base all of the assets from Module 1 on a 32 by 32 pixel grid. So set dimensions to 32 by 32, set the units to pixels, and make sure Artboards is checked off, and then click Create. Because we're using so few pixels, our image starts out very small on our screen. Simply hitting Ctrl or Command 0 on your keyboard, though, will zoom it into full size. Next, we need to change Photoshop's image interpolation method. Go to Edit, Preferences, General. Here you can see that interpolation method is set to bicubic by default. This is great for editing photos, but it will cause problems for pixel-based sprite art. Instead, set it to nearest neighbor. This means as we move and adjust our artwork, it will maintain nice hard edges and crisp colors. Next, go down to Grids and Guidelines. Just like our document size, we want to set the grid dimensions to 32 pixels. Set the number of subdivisions to 4 and pick any color you like. Personally, I like gray because it doesn't affect my perception of other colors while I'm working. Click OK. And now that our preferences are set, let's arrange our user interface. All I really need to do is set the toolbar on the left and the layer panel on the right. You can get rid of all of these other panels by going up to Window and clicking them till they disappear. Next, we need to make some adjustments to our most commonly used tools. The brush tool is great for painting, but bad for sprite art. We want to use the pencil tool as it will lay in solid color 1 pixel at a time. Hold down the left mouse button on the tools panel where brush is and select pencil tool. The pencil tool lets us lay down individual colors on individual pixels, and it will be our most used tool in creating sprite art. The eraser tool is similar to the brush. We want to set it to pencil mode as well. Select the eraser tool and choose pencil from its drop-down menu. The paint bucket will be used to block in large contained areas of color and to change colors we aren't satisfied with. Select the paint bucket tool from the gradient toolbar and change the tolerance to 1 and turn anti-aliasing off. Leave contiguous on for now. This is something we'll want to turn on and off as we need it later. Now that we have Photoshop set up for pixel art, we can save this layout as a workspace. Up in our right hand corner, we see this little menu bar. Click it, and we can create a new workspace. I'm going to name this Pixel Art, and I'm going to contain all of my keyboard shortcuts, menus, and toolbars. This will remember everything that I've set up here. Go ahead and click Save. And this way, when we want to go back and forth between something like digital painting and pixel art, all we have to do is choose pixel art from this little drop-down menu. So for instance, I set this one up for digital sketching, which is a slightly different layout, and if I click pixel art, it'll switch me back to the user interface that I need. Lastly, we want to work while being able to see our concept art and a preview of our pixel art in progress. Open the treasure chest concept art that Ricardo gave us from last lesson. I stored it here on my desktop. By dragging the window into our pixel canvas, we can see both at once. Adjust the frame to get the chest and its color palette in our view. While we need to be pretty close to our pixel art to see that we're laying down colors in very specific areas, it's sometimes hard to see what the final result will look like in our game when we're this close up. We can create a little preview window for ourselves. Go up to Window, Arrange, and choose New Window for Untitled, as this is the name of our document right now. And just like with the concept art, we can drag this window down into our canvas and see a little preview of what our final game resolution art will look like. Now we're ready to start creating some assets. In our next video, you will learn how to create your first asset, a sprite of a pirate's treasure chest. See you then.
Hi everyone, this is Ricardo, and this is the video about how to create a concept of a treasure chest. And we're also going to talk about color schemes, how to create color schemes. We're going to discuss a little bit about materials for the chest and how to make it readable. So let's get started. What I'm doing here is I'm laying in the basic proportions of the chest, a front view and a side view. So from the side, I think it should be better to have this pretty much as a square, but actually the top of it will be rounded. So let's use the square as a base, and let's draw two diagonal lines. They're very faint, but I guess you can see. And this gives me the center so I can see the apex of my arc. So let's try to draw this arc here to have the profile of our treasure chest. Okay, let's erase what we don't need. And now I have the basic proportions of my chest. Now I have a good understanding of the volumes of my chest, front and side view. But it's time to tackle a little bit of perspective. So let's draw the chest in perspective. Let's try to give like a three-dimensional look to this chest. So I'm choosing a diagonal point of view with a 2-point perspective setup. Okay, I'm not laying in horizon lines and vanishing points. I'm just thinking about like an intuitive perspective. The lines seem to be converging to a certain point. But what I want here is to have the volume. I don't want to get obsessed with technicalities. So I just need a good base for start my understanding of the proportions of this chest in a three-dimensional view. Okay, so I'm trying to correct here a little bit more of the proportions. It was a little bit too rectangular. I need it to be like a square from the side view so I can create the same profile and then project this profile to the length of the treasure chest. So here's the top line, and I should have the same angle of curvature on the other side. So pretty much this will be my treasure chest. I think I can make it a little bit taller. So I'm adding a little section under what I was drawing. And it doesn't affect anything. It's just a correction in terms of proportion. Okay. So I can have my treasure chest seen in perspective as a three-dimensional volumetric form. Okay? Alright, so let's erase some of the sketch lines. Let's leave just the essential, but also let's keep some of the sketch lines to leave it an artistic feel to our concept. Okay? Remember, this is not a technical drawing, this is a sketch. This is just a concept sketch. So make it loose. Don't get too precise with like brushes and measurements. It's just like a loose sketch. The important thing here is to keep a good sense of proportion. Okay? Now that we have a good proportion to our chest, let's create the top and the bottom sections of the chest. And I think it's a good time to think about some of the variations we can have for the design of the chest. Okay? So once we establish the front view, the side view, and the perspective view to have a good sense of volume, it's a good time to start thinking about the main design, for example, of the front of the chest. So let's create some of the elements here, the lid, and some of like metal portions, so we can have a little bit of variation in the materials. Okay, and this is good design thinking. It's very important that you plan like what kind of materials are you going to use on each section. It's very important to be aware of this, to have something interesting to show. Okay, one of the biggest mistakes beginners do is they are more concerned about, for example, okay, it's all made of wood, and for the keyhole it's just an opening. But if you think about, you can have some metal rims around the chest, and the keyhole can be also made of the same metal portion. This creates variety in the materials, variety in the way light is reflected from your chest and the way you paint it, and of course, it all influences the color schemes you choose to create your props. So it's very important to think about this as something that will bring variation to your scene. Okay, so now I'm thinking I can have two locks, one on each side of the keyhole. Let's create another version here. And it's very important that you explore possibilities. Okay, usually your first choice is the poor one. Okay, so it's important to explore ideas. Remember, concept is all about exploration. If you do concept art for a game, for example, it's expected that you explore a lot before sending in like finished versions, before actually art directors can pick a finished version. So you are expected to create a lot of exploratory shapes and sketches and silhouettes and try to understand what's the best design that fits the needs of the project. Okay, so keep exploring until you feel comfortable that you have one good version. So this one, I'm using 2 extra rims of metal around the lid, and let's keep it like this. This is a variation of the first idea. Actually, the second idea on the bottom left is pretty cool, but maybe a little bit busy. So I think by looking at this that the upper and the bottom part are not well balanced. So I'm gonna add 2 extra details, which probably are going to be metal here, so I can have a better sense of composition for my chest. Remember, you have the big composition with everything in your scene, and you have the composition of the single elements. You have to think about those as well, okay? And this is also something important. Always work with the sense of what can you do to improve your design. Otherwise, you're just creating meaningless doodles, okay? So think about what can be done to improve your design. So let's think about this chest here. And let's make the keyhole. I think this is the best design actually. This proportion is a little bit better. It's a little less wide. Yeah, I think that's the best. So let's begin considering the grayscale. Now that I have my winning design, I can think about the ways it's going to be read. So I think about where the lights are going to be, where the darks are going to be, what kind of contrasts can I create here. So let's start by filling this with a flat gray, okay? So beginning with a flat brush, I'm only thinking about the dominant tone. So it's going to be fairly dark. I'm not concerned about the beauty of my brush strokes. I'm just trying to fill this with a flat gray. Okay, and now that I have my dominant tone set in, I can start thinking about ways to create contrast. So let's start by darkening the wood portions a little bit. Okay, so let's make this fairly darker than the base tone. Also at the bottom. And remember, this is the kind of work you do to test how the viewers are going to read your shapes. Is everything clear? Are they going to be able to understand what they are seeing in like a couple of seconds? Okay, so let's make the metal portions a little bit lighter. And this introduces a little bit of contrast to my chest. So you can see now from a distance, I can tell like what is light, what is dark, and there's a certain rhythm in the patterns of light and dark, and this is very desirable, okay? Let's bring a very dark color to the keyhole, to the center, preferably something almost black, because this is the focal point actually. Now with an even lighter gray, let me create some highlights here to simulate the turning angle of the metal receiving the light. So we begin to have a little bit of volume even in this front view, which is pretty flat. But these highlights actually introduce a volumetric element and make us believe that this is not flat any longer. Okay? So I'm applying some highlights to the rim of the metal around the keyhole. Let's create some highlights also on the wood portions. They are going to be less intense because they reflect the light differently than the metal portions. But this all helps conveying the idea of volume, okay? And of course, whenever we choose our color scheme, we have to choose accordingly. We have to choose our color scheme in a way that we have the colors matching the contrast of the tones, okay? Which is pretty much, I think, what I can handle now. So what I'm going to do is, after duplicating, I'm going to create a new layer and clip it to the layer below so I can use the colors constrained to the grayscale scheme I created, okay? Let me move this away a little bit. Let me put this up here, replacing our front view. And let's go to the colors. I'm going to bring a color scheme I thought of for this, and I'm going to explain you that. So it's a fairly warm, so I want this to be like wood and golden pieces of metal. So I chose a fairly hot color scheme, and there's a lot of contrast on it. You can see from the 2 dabs of color at the bottom, which I am adjusting now, they are pretty light. And the 2 dabs of color at the top, they are pretty dark and intense. So I'm gonna have a lot of contrast for this chest, okay? So let me lock this layer so I don't accidentally paint on it. And again, let's clip this layer to the layer below. And let's put this layer into color mode so I can just add color by taking advantage of the tones I already have. Okay, so even the highlights, I'm going to touch up the highlights later, but I could pretty much use this. And you can see now that this looks like a good wood color. It's a good start for me. Let's handle the metal portions. So let's begin with this bright orange here. And of course, there's work to be done on top of that, but this creates a strong focal point in any environment, because the environment for the project we are creating, they're mainly done with blues, aquas, and cool colors, and this is a fairly warm scheme, so this is gonna draw a lot of attention. Okay, so now I'm working with a little bit more of a golden color on top of the orange, so I'm taking advantage of the transparency of the brush strokes, and the two colors are visually mixing, and this looks like a good representation of a golden material. Okay, so remember, materials are very important because they create variety in your scene, as I said before. So the highlights are going to be fairly yellow, and I'm going to have the highlights on the wood, of course, much darker than in the metal, but they don't need to be uninteresting. So I think this orange is a pretty good color for the highlight on the wood. Okay, so let's organize everything now into a beautiful presentation. This is actually pretty simple and pretty direct, but always think about the color scheme that matches your project. What are the needs you have? Where is this going to be? What kind of colors do you need? What kind of saturation do you need? Is it something that's going to be visible, or it's something that's going to be subtle, more merged with the color surrounding? Okay, so this is really important. Now I'm working on aligning things and making a beautiful presentation for my project. So I have here the front view, the side view, the perspective view, a color scheme, a grayscale view, and a colored version of the chest, as well as some variations at the left. Okay, so this makes a good, what we call a model sheet. So we can have this presented to our directors and to other artists in the project. Okay, so thanks for watching, and I see you all in the next video.
Hi, in this lesson, we're going to take our first look into the realm of color. Some people say that color is to seeing what flavor is to eating. It gives us pleasure, it gives us harmonies and relationships we could not have in any other way. Color, however, is not an easy subject, but you can master it if you understand the basic principles behind it. So, in this lesson, we're going to take a look at the properties of color, what makes color, and how can we deal with color relationships. So, let's take a look at the properties of color in the first place. There are three basic properties of color. The first one is hue. Hue is the color itself. So, red, yellow, green, cyan, blue, purple, pink, they are all hues. Okay, each one of them is a separate hue. The second property we're going to look into is saturation. Saturation can be considered the degree of purity of a given color. So the more grayed this color is, the less saturated it is. The more pure, the more saturated. And the third property of a color is brightness. Brightness is the degree of lightness or darkness you have on a given color. So the more black you mix into this color, the less bright it is, and the more white you mix, the brighter it is. Okay? So we have these three properties composing each and every color you see in nature. So whatever color you see, try to judge it by asking yourself, what is the hue? Is it saturated? How bright or dark it is? Now let's take a look at the color wheel. The color wheel is a great visual aid to help us understand colors and colors relationships. It is usually organized in a successive manner to help us understand color gradations and also color opposites. It's really easy to understand this by looking at the color wheel. Let's take a look at some of the most basic color schemes which will help us understand all the other more complex color schemes. The first one is the primary color scheme. Primary colors are yellow, red, and blue when we talk about pigment, and red, green, and blue when we talk about light. Let's consider red, yellow, and blue here so it makes it easier for us to understand color and color relationships. So, primary colors has this name because they are the first colors. They cannot be mixed from any other colors. And red, yellow, and blue, when mixed, they originate all other colors. If you mix them in pairs, we have the secondary colors. So if you mix yellow and red, you have orange. If you mix yellow and blue, you have green. And if you mix red and blue, you have the purple. Secondary colors are very vibrant, but less vibrant than the primary colors. Okay, let's take a look now. If you mix primary and secondary, you have tertiary colors. Okay, and every time you mix these colors, you are making them less vibrant, less pure, but these colors are still considered very pure because they are mixed from pure hues. Okay, so we have the primary, secondary, and tertiary colors, and you can see that this completes our color wheel. Now let's take a look at some other combinations we can take out from our color wheel. Let's take a look at the complementary colors. Complementary colors are colors opposed in the color wheel. So yellow, purple, red and green, orange and blue are all complementary to each other. This means that whenever they are put together side by side, they enhance each other in terms of vibration and luminosity. But if you mix them, you make them less pure and darker. Okay? So it's very important to understand this relationship between complementary colors, because if you mix or if you put them side by side, they will have very different effects on each other. And there are other more advanced color schemes which will give us amazing effects on our images. Let's take a look at some of these color schemes in our next lesson. Hi everyone. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the Photoshop interface so you can know your way around Photoshop. Let's begin by taking a look at the menu bar. The menu bar is located on top left corner of Photoshop, and it contains a lot of items pretty similar to any other software you'll probably use on a daily basis, such as File, Edit, Image, and so on. There are also drop-down menus. Whenever you click an item, you have these drop-down menus with a lot of options, such as New to create a new file, Open an existing file, Open recent files, and so on. There are several options on every single item at the menu bar, and naturally, we are not going to look at every single one of them because this would make our lesson too long. But feel free to explore and look through them. Okay? Now let's take a look at the toolbar. The toolbar is located on the left of Photoshop interface. It contains all the tools you need to create and modify your images. At the toolbar, you'll find tools such as Move, the Brush tool, Eraser, Gradient, the Rotate tool, Zoom, and additionally, every tool at the toolbar which has a tiny triangle at the lower right corner, it possesses a drop-down menu as well. On the drop-down menu, you have other options for the tool. And also, for every tool, you have the Properties bar, which is located right below the menu bar. The Properties bar gives you control to modify your selected tool. And it's different for every tool you select. In case of the brush, you can change the blending mode of the brush, pretty much like you do with the layers. You can change the opacity, you can change the flow, okay? And let's suppose you select another tool such as this mud tool. You have other controls such as strength. You can also select the option to sample all the layers or finger painting, for example. And the properties bar also gives you the option of selecting the tool presets, which means there are different options pre-selected for the given tool you chose. And in Photoshop, we also have tabs or windows. So let's say you want to move the brush presets window. You just need to grab it by the top of the window and move it around. You can dock and undock groups of windows, and you can find all of them in case some are missing under the window drop-down menu. Just click whatever item you are looking for and the tab will appear. Okay? That's very handy because you can customize your interface according to your needs, to the projects you are creating. So, in order to customize your interface and create groups of windows, all you need to do is to drag one window over another one. And when the blue rectangle appears, just let go of your mouse button. And then you create a group. Now, they both can be moved as a unit. Okay? And you can drag this to the bottom, for example, of another group of windows to create a group within a group. And you can move these limits up and down and create bigger or smaller windows by moving up and down the intersection between them. Okay? So let's create a file and see the options we have. We need to go to File, New, and then you have a new window with a lot of information. For example, the size of the file you want. You have probably a lot of options with different sizes, with different resolutions, okay? And on the right corner of this window, you have a lot of options such as orientation. You can choose from portrait and landscape. You can choose, for example, a custom color for your file from this color picker. So let's go with this grayish color for our file. Let's click OK. And now let's click on Create File. And now we have a new file open in Photoshop on which we can paint. We can create new layers at the Layers window. We can select different properties for our tools at the Properties bar. And of course, we can paint using a brush. And the brush tool offers a lot of options for customization. It can be a little bit daunting at the very beginning because there's a lot to choose from, but once you understand how it works, it becomes a real pleasure to work with. So let's take a look at how the brush tool works in our next lesson.
In this video, you will learn how to create this pixel art pirate chest. Hi there, Andrew here. In the last video, you learned how to set up Photoshop to create sprite art. Now you're ready to start generating sprites. For our first asset, we have chosen something relatively simple, a treasure chest. I'll take you step by step through outlining, coloring, shading, and then adding detail to the final asset. I've given our background layer a mid-tone gray to make our guidelines easier to see. And I've created a new layer to draw all of our pixels onto. The first thing we want to do is lay in the outlines for the chest. We can see from the concept that the treasure chest should be a little wider than it is tall, so I don't want to use the entire sprite area. Because the treasure chest is going to sit on the ground in our game, it will be easier if we see the bottom of the chest at the bottom of the frame. I'm using black to set in the color for now, but I can always change it later. Once we have proportions we like, create the line that will represent the lid of the chest. Then we draw out the metal bands that keep the chest together. Finally, I want to create the lock for the chest, so I erase some of the metal banding and I lay in a few pixels of black on a diagonal to give it an overall round shape. A simple block of black in the center will represent the keyhole. Now that I have the outline of my chest, I can start laying in colors. The palette Ricardo created includes 3 colors for the wood and 3 colors for the metal. I want to choose the mid-tones of each to start with. This way I can paint both highlights and shadows. With the pencil tool selected, hold down the Alt or Option key to use the eyedropper to sample the mid-tone wood color. Then use the paint bucket tool with contiguous turned on to fill the wood areas in on the chest. Fill in the metal areas with the metal mid-tone color. The sprite is clearly a chest, although it lacks detail. To give the asset more depth, we're going to add some shading and highlights. Begin by taking the darkest wood tone and drawing shadows under the lid. This is meant to show that the lid overlaps the chest and helps it stand out on its own. We do the same on the metal bands at the bottom of the chest with the darkest metal color. We want to imagine a light source for our sprite and keep it consistent across all of our assets. Lighter colors face our light source, darker colors face away. In this way, we create the illusion of depth in a small, flat pixel art asset. We want to demonstrate that the metal bands reflect light differently than the wood to show that they are different materials, so I'm changing the metal highlights to give them a banding effect. Then I add some more dark wood tones to the bottom of the chest to draw more contrast with the lid and add more metal banding. At this stage, we could be complete with the asset, but I want to add a little bit more subtlety. The technique of interlacing colors with each other is called dithering. This allows us to create subtle transitions while still only using a few colors. One last thing I want to change is the outline color of the chest. Our dark brown would work just as well here, and it will help us reduce the number of colors used by one. Simply turn off contiguous mode on the paint bucket and paint any of the black areas with our own dark brown. I generally like to reserve high contrast colors like black and white for main player characters because they tend to draw more attention. To get our chest ready for Unity, I want to hide the background layer and erase any pixels that aren't relevant to the chest. The checkerboard pattern indicates transparency, which I need to hide the top area of the sprite from Unity. Now go to File, Save, and save the asset with a name you will remember in a location that's easy to find. Now that our treasure chest is done, you are ready to put it into a game. In the next video, I'll show you how to create a 2D Unity project and how to import assets for pixel art games. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a 2D Unity project and properly add pixel art assets. Hi there, Andrew here. Now that our first asset is complete, we are ready to import our first asset into a fresh project. It's always a good idea to test out your asset pipeline right away. That way, if there's a problem importing, you only have one thing to fix. This is why we'll be learning about importing into Unity now, rather than when all of our sprite assets are completed. When Unity opens, we see a welcome screen with your most recently used projects. We are going to create a new project for Module 1. Click the radio toggle to set the project to 2D. Give the project any name you'd like and make sure it is set on a good location. Organization doesn't really matter here. I'm just setting mine to the name of my university's game program, Game Dev at MSU. And you're ready to create your project. The Unity window can be a little overwhelming at first, but we only need to use a couple of things. In Unity, our project is comprised of scenes. It helps to think of the project as the game and the scenes as the levels. On the left is the hierarchy pane. This is a list of anything that is currently in the scene. The scene view shows a visual representation of where things are laid out. The Game tab will show us a preview of what our game will look like when we run it. The Assets pane contains all of the assets that are in our project. Lastly, the Inspector pane is where we can change settings for our assets. To import our treasure chest, right-click on the Asset pane and choose Import New Asset. Navigate to the treasure chest PSD and click OK. We can drag the treasure chest from the Asset pane into the scene view to drop it into our scene. By pressing the F key on our keyboard, we can focus on the sprite. Unity will import and compress the asset for us, but that can create some problems. We can see that our sprite looks fuzzy. Just like Photoshop, Unity needs to be told how to interpret these pixels. In the Inspector tab, change filter mode from bilinear to point. Now the pixels are coming in clean, but the colors are all wrong. By default, Unity likes to compress all images to save space and processing power. To fix this, click the Default tab and set compression to none and hit apply. Now our asset looks just like it did in Photoshop. If we click on the game view, we can see that the sprite is pretty small. We can manipulate the asset with Select, Move, Rotate, and Scale tools in the upper left-hand corner. But scaling the chest manually can be tricky, and it will make it hard to keep all of our sprites a consistent size. Select the treasure chest from the asset pane. We don't want to select the chest from the scene or hierarchy view, that's just a copy. By changing settings on the asset, we will change every sprite generated in a scene from that asset. In the inspector pane, set pixel per unit to 32. Just like in Photoshop, this lets us say that 32 pixels represents one Unity unit. Now our sprites are perfectly scaled in our scene. The last thing we're going to want to do is save this scene. While the project was saved as soon as we completed it, we have to save our individual scenes or levels. Simply go to Save, Scene As, and give the scene any name that you want. You're now free to close Unity and it will save all your progress. That completes week 1. In week 2, you will learn how to generate concepts for environments and turn them into tiling assets that we can use for generating game levels.
Hi everyone. In this video we are going to talk about composition. Let's take a look at some basics of composition and how to create good composition by using simple shapes. So let's first begin by looking at the definition of composition. So composition can be defined as a thing composed of various elements, the action of putting things together, the way in which a whole or mixture is made up. And as Plato, the old Greek philosopher, would put, composition is the representation of variety within the unity. So basically, composition is the combination of the several elements you have available to you within a definite boundary. And speaking of boundaries, you should always work within a definite shape, within a definite boundary, be it a rectangle, a square, a circle, whatever. But if you sketch on a surface without any definite boundaries, you are just doodling. It's just a loose sketch and you are not relating the parts to the whole. So let's begin by thinking about simple shapes within a rectangular boundary. So let's begin with a simple triangle centered into our frame. This is the most extreme example of unity. We don't have anything to contrast with this triangle. We don't have any kind of unbalance because of the position of the triangle. So we have a static composition. So let's gradually begin to introduce a little bit of variety. So if we think about different shapes, this is actually the extreme example of variety. A lot of different shapes, not a single repetition, so they don't have any kind of relationship with each other in terms of size, in terms of shape, in terms of angles. So this is a classic extreme example of variety. Now, let's consider the repetition as a composing unit. So if we have, for example, several triangles such as this. So this is a little bit better. We have a little bit of variety because we create different spaces, but also it's still a little bit boring because it's the same size triangle over and over. So there's a little bit more variety, but there's still a lot of unity. We need to balance a little bit better unity and variety to have a good composition. So we can change a little bit the sizes of the triangles so we can have a different feel for our composition. And now we have different spaces between the shapes, between the different triangles. We have a different setup by combining two triangles into one. So we have a little bit of a broken triangle, so to speak. So we have a little bit more of a variety, and we can have even more if we change the proportions of these triangles. Now, some of them are more spiky, some of them are really wide, and some are small. So we have variety, but we still have a lot of unity because we are only dealing with triangles. But this composition feels a lot better, and we are only dealing with one single shape. So let's take a look at how we can introduce even more variety without breaking the unity. We can change the tones. So we can have lighter triangles, slightly darker triangles, and the black triangles. And now not only we have variety in shape, size, position, proportions, but we also have a little bit of change in tone, which also gives us depth. We are not obliged, however, to use only triangles. We have different triangles here, which already gives us a lot of unity and a lot of variety because we've changed a little bit of the aspects of these triangles, but we can start introducing other shapes. Following the same principles, we have this broken rectangle. Actually, the corners of these rectangles are broken, so it's the same shape, but we are following the same principles of difference in size and difference in position. And you can see that now with these rectangles in the front and the triangles in the back, we have a hint of an environment. We have depth, and now we have a background with what could be trees or mountains or whatever you want them to be. But we have variety, we have unity, we have depth. So all this was built with simple shapes within a boundary. So this is the power of composition. Think about your shapes, think about unity, think about variety, think about balancing both, and then by combining the several elements, taking these principles of unity and variety into account, you can have great compositions in your scenes. So thanks for watching this video, and I see you all on the next one. Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to talk about environment design. As we've seen in our previous video, a good design or good composition is a combination of unity and variety. I actually separated a few shapes here, which already brings me some variety, so I can make a good composition by combining and changing these forms around. So let's get started. I'll begin with this platform shape by using the free transform. And let's change the size and shape of it by Control T. And let's use a couple of those. And remember, we have variety in our shapes, but what's going to bring unity is the repetition of shapes. And by repetition, I don't mean have the same shapes over and over. Actually, we can have variations of these shapes, but as long as they have the same characteristics, such as the same straight vertical lines, the same cuts in the corners, the same overall shape, we can have a lot of unity. So let's combine these two actually to make a different shape, but one which still retains the same characteristics of the basic platform shape. And notice that what makes our design interesting is not only a repetition of the shapes, but also changing the space between the shapes creates an interesting design because it creates an interesting rhythm. Let's accept the transformation. And now let's place one last bit of the platform here on the corner of our frame, so as it works as a transition to another possible screen. So let's repeat the same procedure, transform it, and well, pretty much this makes our foreground elements, our foreground platforms. Let's just trim what we don't need here. Let's keep our image as clean as possible. Okay, now let's make a group with the platforms, and let's rename the group Foreground Platforms. Okay, and now let's repeat the same procedure with the second level of mountains, the second layer actually, which will be our middle ground. So duplicate the shape of the mountain, and remember, you can place this mountain wherever you want. Let's just change the shape a little bit, and let's flip horizontal so we can have a mirrored image of the mountain, which serves as a good entry point for the screen. Let's repeat the procedure, duplicate the mountain, and let's transform it. Remember, varied shapes and size and angles, all this creates interest in your composition. Okay, let's accept it, and let's place the other one. Just remember to duplicate the shape, which I just forgot. So Control J, and let's place this one in the middle, and we can keep the shape as it is. So we have a variety of heights and shapes in our middle ground. Let's just trim again what we don't need. So make a selection with the right layer selected and hit delete. And let's do it with this other side here, so we can keep our frame as clean as possible. And again, let's make a group with our middle ground mountains. Let's rename this group Mountains Middle Ground MG, and let's accept it. And now let's repeat the same procedure with the background mountains. So we copy the basic shape and we place this shape behind the middle ground mountains. And it also helps us with the sense of scale, because whenever you have an object in the background which is bigger than whatever is in front of it, it looks massive. It looks like giant rock formations. So it's a pretty good way to convey scale. Okay, so let's keep adding shapes. And you can see that here I'm duplicating the shape pretty much as I did with the platforms in the foreground. And this creates a visual pattern, which is good for Unity. And now I'm mimicking the shape of the rock in the middle ground on the left. You can see that it's pretty much the same angle. And again, it creates unity. And that's it for our background rocks. So let's create a group with all the shapes and rename it to Mountains Background. So let's write Mountains Background BKG. And let's move on to our next shape, which is the bush. So I'm gonna have to move the layer to be behind the foreground, but in front of the middle ground. Okay, so let's resize it. And you can see that now I'm incorporating an organic element inside a pretty geometric composition of shapes. So it creates another level of variety. We had variety because we had like rectangular and triangular shapes with different sizes and angles. But now we have something which is more organic with curves, which we didn't have before. So this brings variety, but as we need unity, we need to repeat this shape as much and as wisely as possible. So let's move our bushes in front of the middle ground, and of course behind the background. And again, different sizes and shapes and placement, so we have different intervals between shapes. Okay, let's put this on the right side of this platform. And you can see that just by overlapping these shapes, we have a great sense of depth already without too much effort. Okay, so we have these bushes already composing our image. And let's create something more interesting here, which is a sky. So we can pretty much darken a little bit the background behind the shapes. Let's place it behind the background. And let's darken it just a little bit. Okay. Now we just got even more depth. And let's duplicate our bush shape and bring it behind the background in front of the sky. Let's place it and resize it so it looks as a cloud. Okay, so you can see that we bring unity by repeating shapes. I mean, it's the same basic shape, we just copied that shape and we are now resizing it. And of course, we are going to change the color so we can have a white cloud, lighter than sky. Yes, just a little bit. And let's click OK. And let's create another one. But this time, let's place this other one in front of the background. I think it's going to be cool to have this layer of cloud going in between the mountains. So let's move this up a little bit. And look at this. We have now a lot of depth, a lot of like overlapping shapes with different angles, different configurations, but also a lot of unity because we have repetition everywhere. Let's trim whatever we don't want. And there we go. And now we have a beautifully designed environment by using only 4 shapes and applying the principles of unity and variety. So study these principles and apply them to your compositions, and you'll see that the possibilities are endless. So thanks for watching, and I see you all in the next video.
In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a simple, tileable dirt sprite that you can use to make pixel art environments in Unity. Last week we talked about color palettes, Photoshop, and how to make a basic sprite for pixel art games. This video will show you how we can apply those same techniques to make modular tiling pieces that can be assembled on a grid to make levels for our games. Tiling is the key word here. We want to make sure we note in what directions the tiles need to line up. The result will be a simple sprite that we can place together without any seams. First, we create a 32 by 32 pixel document just like we did in the treasure chest chapter. I also have a palette in the corner that I have created for this activity. It contains all the colors you need to make the environment tiles, but you can feel free to use your own colors if you wish. Just make sure you follow the tips from week 1 on choosing colors. Start by filling in the background with the darkest color from our dirt palette. On this sort of tile, it's easier to start with the darkest color and then add light up in stages. By adding light rather than shadow, we get more control over the direction of our light source and generally get a more pleasing result. With the second darkest color, start painting oblong, round shapes for our rocks. Try to vary up the sizes, but keep the distance between them fairly even. I want to give each rock its own shape, but I want to keep them from touching. Once I have filled the canvas with rocks, go to Filter, Other, Offset. By setting our offset to 16 pixels, we will move the left and right sides into the center as well as the top and bottom. We do this so we can make sure the edges of the tiles will line up with each other. Once you've done that, you can use the darkest 2 colors to refine your shapes along the center cross. Now that we can be sure these rocks will tile, start laying in the middle color from our palette. I'm imagining a light source from the top and left. The more highlight I give the rock, the more it appears to pop out from the tile. So some rocks will get a lot of this highlighting, some will get less, or maybe even none at all. When I'm satisfied with this level of highlight, I apply the tiling again with Ctrl or Command plus F, and then I adjust the highlights as needed. I continue in this fashion with the next 2 lightest dirt colors. Each time I paint smaller highlights until I use just a few individual pixels for the brightest color. We don't want to overdo it with the highlights. Remember, this is the environment. It should fade into the background, so we want to keep the contrast subtle. Our first tile is complete. In the next video, I'll show you how to create variations of this single tile to make an entire set of tiles. In this video, I'll show you how to turn a simple tiling texture into a set of sprites for making pixel art game environments. Hi there, Andrew here. In the last video, I showed you how to make a dirt tile that could fit onto our grid and would seamlessly line up with itself. Now we will take that single tile and turn it into a series of tiles that can be used to create a variety of levels. Create a new document at 256 by 256 pixels. This will give us plenty of space to create multiple tiles and multiple variations. Open the dirt tile from the last video, duplicate the background layer, then Control or Command click the copied layer. Press Control or Command C to copy, and then paste it into our new document with Control or Command V. Now that the tile is a new layer, we can use the Move tool to make sure it is lined up with our 32 by 32 pixel grid. For more information on setting up this grid, check out Week 1 Setting Up Photoshop. With the Move tool, holding Alt or Option while dragging lets us make a copy of that layer, and thus the tile. Create a new layer over the newly created tile. This is where we will paint the grass that sits on top of the dirt. Just like with the dirt tile, we want to start with the darkest color, filling out the silhouette of the grass hanging over the dirt. Grass generally won't grow on a vertical surface, so I'm keeping it at the top of the sprite. Like the dirt before, go up in brightness on our palette, making the areas smaller and smaller as you go, until the brightest color is just a few pixels. Then, to help the grass pop out from the dirt, paint shadows on the dirt tile with the darkest dirt color. Select the grass layer and merge it with the dirt tile by pressing Ctrl or Command E. This will merge the current layer with the one below. Now we can duplicate these layers by Alt or Option dragging with the Move tool just like before to create a left and right grass tile. Modify both the side and middle tiles to make sure the grass lines up without seams. Continue to duplicate the original dirt tile until we have a grid of 9 tiles in total, as you can see here. Once you have done that, use the eraser tool to remove some of the pixels from the far edge of the sprite. This will create a more natural looking edge for our dirt tiles. Continue around the edges of all the tiles, erasing and modifying the grass and rocks as needed until you're happy with the result. Now you have a set of 9 tiles that you can use to make a whole host of levels. You may want to take some time to create alternative middle tiles to break up the monotony of scenes containing lots of dirt tiles. You can also create a set of tiles for interior edges where grass will line up with the vertical walls. In the next video, I'll show you how to use these techniques to make background tiles for your scene as well. In this video, I'll show you how you can use Unity to break up single images into multiple tiles for use in constructing levels for our games. Hi there, Andrew here. In the last video, I showed you how to create the background panel for our pixel art games. I also created a few props to add flavor to our scene using the same techniques from Module 1. Here we are going to use Unity to turn these into tiling assets that we can use to make our levels. I've taken all the background panels and turned them into a single document. I've also done the same thing with the ground tiles. I imported them into Unity and set their scaling and color compression as shown in Module 1. Select the ground tile asset in the inspector and choose Multiple from the Sprite mode. This will let us turn the single image into several tiles. When the sprite editor pops up, select Slice and set the grid type to cell size. Since these tiles are 32 by 32, that's what we'll choose for our pixel size. I'm setting the pivot point to bottom left. This will make it easier for us to line it up with our grid and with each other. We repeat this process with the background panels, but instead this time we're going to set the size to 128 pixels by 160. Once that is done, we can expand the image in our asset panel, and here we can see the slices that were created. By dragging the background panels into the scene, I can quickly create a background setting. Since everything is designed to match the grid, if the game's object's position in the X and Y axis is a whole number, I can simply hold Control or Command while I'm moving it to keep everything snapped to the grid. For the ground tiles, I'm blocking out the scene with the middle ground tile first. Then I replace them with the correct tile by selecting them and choosing the appropriate tile from the inspector pane. I could also just place them one by one, but this would be time consuming and not give me as much flexibility as I try out different configurations when laying out my level. Lastly, I'm going to bring in the bushes and rocks I made earlier to give the scene more depth. While we think of the scene as a 2D one, when assets overlap like the rocks with the ground texture, the z-axis matters. I needed the ground texture to have a higher number in the z-axis than the rocks. The z-axis here represents how close something is to the camera. The higher the number, the closer it is. So make sure your background tiles have the lowest z-axis numbers, followed by the background objects like rocks and bushes, and then the ground tiles. When we add characters in our next module, we will want to give them an even higher z-axis position than the ground, so they appear as if they are standing on top of it. That wraps up week 2 of Module 1. Now that you have some of the techniques down, you can create new types of tiles or variations on current ones. Next week, we'll take what we've learned so far and apply them to sprite-based game characters.
Hi everyone. In this video, let's talk about character design. Let's apply the same principles we've seen on our composition video and try to apply these principles now to characters as we did with environments in our previous video. So let's get started. Whenever we have a shape, let's say we have a square. Okay, let's draw a square here. If we have 3 equal shapes, we have a perfect example of unity. We don't have any kind of variation, not even in size. Now let's see what happens if we change, for example, the size of these squares. Let's begin with the principle of big, medium, and small. So if we have a big square and we change the shape of this square into a rectangle and have a medium and a small one, we have a much more interesting composition, one which we can combine in several different ways, as you can see from the demonstration, and apply the principles of unity and variety. Unity comes from the rectangular and square shapes, and variety from the sizes. So let's mark these squares and rectangles as B for big, M for medium, and S for small. So we have a medium, a small, and a big shape. And this makes for a much better way to combine shapes than to have 3 equal shapes. Now let's see how this applies to characters. Let's say we have a head, a torso, and a hip. And you can see that it's pretty boring when you have the 3 equal shapes, one on top of each other. So if we change the size and the proportions of each square and rectangle, you see that we have a much more dynamic setup for the figure. So let's play with the shapes and come up with an interesting figure. Let's use a big shape for the head, a small shape for the torso, and a medium shape for the hip, for example. And we have a more interesting configuration than the one above with 3 equal shapes. So let's mark it big, small, and medium. Okay, and let's try another combination with these shapes, and you can see that these shapes provide you the ability to combine in many different ways. So let's have this set up for the head. Let's place the eyes here just for the sake of representation, and let's have like a big torso and a small hip. You can see that this is pretty much the setup for like strong and heroic characters with a little bit of exaggeration, but with a much better design. So let's try to come up with a design for our character, for our game. Since it's a female character, let's go for a small torso, medium hip, and a big shape for the head. And if we add a couple of triangles here, you see that we immediately have an interesting figure with good proportions and much more dynamic than if it was just like square on top of squares. So you can see that I can complete here the waistline with two triangles opposed to each other, a small rectangle for the neck, and I'm following the same principles of just opposing different proportionate shapes. And we can apply the same principles for the design of the head of the character. We can have a square shape for the head, round shapes for the eyes, which gives us contrast in shape, and a small triangle for the nose. And we can have more triangles for the front portion of the hair, and then a big irregular shape. We are having contrast and unity in the design of the head of the character. Okay? So let's begin refining our character now. Still exploring the design of the character. Let's turn off this layer, and by creating a new layer, let me redraw the character with the better proportions we came up with on our last section. So a bigger shape for the head, small shape for the torso, and medium shape for the hips, slightly triangular shapes for the legs, and we have variation in sizes and shapes, a larger shape for the hair to break up with the evenness of the shapes of the head, round eyes, and small nose. So you can see that we have a pretty good design for a cartoony character. And now, of course, we can add details such as the feet and the arms. Okay. All very simple. You can see that in order to design a good character, you don't need to be a master of the anatomy or the human figure, even though you need to know that it is a good knowledge to have. You don't need to be a master of drawing. You can practice drawing all your life, but you need to understand the design principles to design a good character. So let's create a profile view of our character so we can explore more the design. Okay, by keeping the same proportions, big head, small torso, and medium hip, and larger shape for the hair. Okay, following the same principles, let's suppose curved and straight lines for the profile of the legs, and a small shape for the feet. Let's sketch the features of our character, small oval shape for the eye, and just a small shape for the nose. And you can see we kept the same basic proportions, but with different angles, okay? Let's refine the head of our character, and you see that the same principles of design are going to be applied here, and that shapes have a meaning, okay? So let's go with the design we currently have. Let's make the hair bigger to break up the oval shape. It's slightly more geometric, and a small shape for the neck. And let's go with the scarf, like a thin one to break the shape of the hair as well, to bring variety to our design. Let's copy this head to a new layer, and let's copy this so we can explore the design a little bit more. I'm using the eraser tool and getting rid of what I want to change now. Let's go for a larger triangular scarf so it creates even more variety in our design by opposing the triangle with the rectangular shape of the hair and the oval shape of the head. So we now have even more contrast, and it looks nice, looks childish, but yet the triangle brings a dynamic element to our design. Let's duplicate this. And this time, let's try to have like a pirate's hat. So let's make an even bigger triangular shape for the rim of the hat. And the top of the hat, another triangular shape, but opposing the previous triangle. Let's have the skull and the bones here. Perhaps this is a little bit too big for the upper portion of our character, and our character may feel too heavy. So let's explore another design here. Let's copy this head to another layer. And let's try to get rid of like anything in the hair, and let's add something like a ponytail. So I'm getting rid of the scarf, and let's have a rounder shape instead of the big rectangular one. And let's add a more angular ponytail. And even though this works really well with our character, it may look a little bit too childish. So you can see that different shapes bring different messages. So decide what kind of message do you want your character to pass to your players, to your observers, okay? I think we're going to go with a triangular scarf because it brings a dynamic element without getting in the way, without being too heavy for our design. Okay, so let's place this 4 head designs of our character a little bit out of the way and below the front and side view of our character. Okay, let's resize it. It looks nice. And basically what you are creating is a model sheet. It's called a model sheet because it will serve as a model for animators, for anyone in the production to use this as a reference to have the character drawn with the correct proportions, correct colors, and to animate the character properly. So let's try to have now a dynamic view of our character. We already have the technical views, the front, side, and designs for the hair and the face of our character. Now let's try to create something a little bit more dynamic, what we call an action shot with the character in a more natural pose so people can see the personality of our character in a much better way than with the technical views. So I'm basically drawing a very simple pose, a very simple skeleton here, so I can use as a pose for my character. So I'm using the same elements we've used before. I think it would be nice to have the idea of a small ponytail, so let's use this to add a little bit of contrast to our shapes. So round eyes, small nose, small neck. And I'm keeping in mind the same design principles we've worked so far. Big, small, and medium shapes. Trying to repeat shapes as triangles and rectangles, but I'm also trying to introduce a little bit more of contrast by creating new shapes, and contrast means variety. So same principles of unity and variety, okay? I'm using more rounder shapes on the legs, but they are still triangular if you consider them as an entire shape, okay? So let's try to refine our design even more and introduce some clothes, some elements that may contrast not only in tone but also in color between themselves. So let's go for long boots for our character. And all this will be taken into consideration when we consider the pattern of values of lights and darks as well as colors. Okay. So let's try to come up with a nice corset for our character. Let's go with just a simple design. It's just a basic idea. We can refine this later, and it's just an experimentation. Okay. Let's go with some gloves. So we bring some weight and interest to the extremity of the arms. And you can see the character is getting pretty interesting just by thinking about other shapes we can introduce to an already well-designed character. Okay, so always consider this. Once you have your design, break this design into smaller, interesting shapes. If you do that, you just make your character more and more interesting if you follow the same principles of unity and variety. Okay? So let's duplicate and resize our character. Control J for duplicate. And let's resize it because now we have a sketch with a more dynamic pose. You can see that it's slightly different from the technical views front and side, but gives us a nice understanding of the personality of the character. So let's move the character a little bit and let's start working with black, white, and grays to create a pattern of lights and darks for the reading of our character. Actually, it's interesting to oppose light, grays, and darks so we can have a good understanding of how the character will appear on screen. So let's go for a light upper portion of the clothes. Let's make it a dark gray for the boots. And this is just a sketch. You don't need to be too mindful about like staying inside the lines. You just need the basic shapes, and we are now filling the shapes with basic shades of gray and black and white, of course. Let's go for the trousers so we can have an opposing tone with the upper portion of our character. So let's fill this with this mid-gray tone. And you can see we have light, middle tone, and dark tone. Okay, let's use the same value for the scarf. It doesn't mean it will be the same color, but it will be the same value, which is important because we also need unity and variety in the tones, in the values. Okay, let's go with the same dark from the boots to the gloves. Let's use a slightly lighter tone for the hair. Like so. And we can use an even lighter tone for the skin. Okay. And whenever you fill your character with tones, you will see that it will have a much stronger presence, a visual presence, than with just lines. So that's why it's important to fill your character with tones and plan the lights and darks for the reading of your character. Okay? Well, this works pretty well. Let's make a simplified version of the reading, some sort of like tonal chart of the distribution of tones in our character. Okay, so let's choose a flat brush, and what I'm gonna do is I'm just going to select the tones and lay the tones on the respective areas. So we have one for the hair, one for the scarf, one for the skin tone, one for the upper portion of the clothes, one for the trousers, and one for the boots. Okay. And you can see that there are no two equal tones next to each other. There is always variation. So let's go for a simple representation of the arms, skin tone, and the dark for the gloves. And then we can duplicate this and just move to the other side because it's the same design. And now we have a good tonal chart for our character. Let's make it smaller. Let's select everything and make it a little bit smaller and place it on top of our page. Let's make the figure itself with the tones and the lines a little bit smaller. Let's place it better here. And let's duplicate this and create a color version of our character. So your model sheet will be complete with technical views, line drawings, dynamic poses, head design, tonal charts and color charts. So let's go with the color. We can use our black and white character and take advantage of the already established tonal scheme. Let's duplicate our tonal chart as well. Let's make the same setup, create a new layer, create a clipping mask, and now let's try to use a color on top of the tones. Let's just change the blending mode of this layer to color. And what it does is it keeps the same tones as the layer beneath, but adds the color you choose on top of that. So we now have a pink hair with the same tone as the hair of the character. We have a greenish scarf. Let's go for a skin tone. And this can be applied to the face and the arms. Her shirt will be light in tone, so let's keep it like this for now. And let's think about her bottom portion, which is trousers and boots. So let's go for a brownish color for the trousers. Let's see, like so. And a darker brown for the boots. Okay. It can be a little bit darker, and the gloves with the same colors. Now let's apply this to our character. But first, let's move our tonal chart to the other side of the color scheme. So by using the move tool, I just move here. It seems more organized to have first the tone and then the colors. Okay. All right, now let's go for the character. So I'm using the same principles by changing this to the color blending mode. Let's make sure it's in color. And now I can apply the color and see our character comes to life. So the pink hair, the greenish scarf. Okay. There's a slight hint of the pink hair underneath the greenish scarf to bring a little bit of variety in the broken shape. So it's a light and vibrant skin tone for the neck, head, and arms. The shirt will still be white. Let's go for the brownish color for the trousers. Okay. And the dark color for the boots and the gloves. Okay. Let's go with this dark brownish color. And you can see the reading of the character is the same because we kept the same tonal scheme. We just added colors on top of it, which adds a little bit more of interest, but still we have the same reading because we kept the same tonal relationships. Okay. Let's make this layer into an overlay layer and make it a little bit darker to have more contrast on the boots and the gloves. Now let's just make some fine tuning here with the colors. I think we need a slightly more vibrant color for the trousers to bring some interest to the lower portion of the character. Okay. Just a little bit more. And of course we need to adjust our color chart above later. It looks good, so let's do the same work here. Let's adjust the same color. Let's have our new layer and place it with the overlay blending mode. And try to adjust. Sometimes it's tricky because we're overlaying colors and we're just eyeballing it. Okay, looks a little bit more accurate. Let's go with the darker colors for the boots. Oh, this is too dark. Let's go with a more reddish color. Slightly darker. It seems good now. Okay, let's just adjust a little bit the trousers, which I'm not entirely happy with, the match with the character. So a little bit more yellowish. So now we have our model sheet complete, and this can be used as a reference for the remaining of the project. So whoever needs to animate or draw this character will have a nice example of the proportions, the color, and the tones of the character. Okay? So thanks for watching, and I see you all in the next video. Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to look on how to create effective designs with color. We're going to look at how to apply in practice what we've seen in our last video about color schemes and color palettes. So let's get started. Let's begin by making a selection with our marquee tool, like so. And let's think about a basic color scheme for our character. So let's go for a balanced color scheme. So let's begin with the basic skin color. A little bit of more neutral tone, like so. And let's go with a more darker and a little bit colder color, still on the warm range. Let's make this a little bit more orange, but darker and a little bit colder for the bottom part of our character. Okay. Now we have the basic colors of what would be the face and some clothes. So let's go with the hair. Let's try to have some, like a little bit warmer color for the hair. And let's go for an accent of color on a detail for our character. Let's move this to a little bit of a contrasting color, bright and slightly saturated, like this. And let's make just a detail here on top of the character. So this is our first color scheme. It's a balanced color scheme because it's composed of mainly neutral colors and just an accent of stronger, more saturated color on top of our character. So let's lock the layer so we don't paint over it by accident. So now the layer is locked. Let's create a new one, and let's try to create a warmer color scheme for that. I'll control click on the thumbnail and move the selection to the side to make sure I have the same size and proportions for my color schemes. So let's copy the basic skin tone. Let's pick up the basic skin tone and just paint inside our selection. And now let's go for a warmer kind of palette. So for what will be the hair of the character, I'm using a slightly more saturated and brighter color. And for what would be the upper portion of the clothes, the shirt, I'm gonna use a little bit more of a warm color, like this orangish, brownish color. And for the bottom part of our character, I'll use the same dark color. And you can notice now that I don't have any kind of contrasting colors on this color scheme. Let's choose a color for the detail of the character, but this time I won't choose anything contrasting. Let's choose something which is bright and slightly less saturated to contrast with the hair color. So let's have something like this. And you can see that our color scheme now falls inside the warm color range. All the colors belong to the warm side of the spectrum. So let's repeat the procedure and lock the layer so we don't paint on it by accident. Just click on the padlock and you see lock the layer. Let's create a new layer. Control click on the thumbnail to make a selection. Like so. And now let's move the selection to the side. And let's try a different color scheme. Click on the layer we're about to paint. And let's begin selecting cooler colors for this color scheme. So I'll begin by selecting this bright greenish color for the top portion of the character. Skin tone will be mainly the same, but now I'm going to make it a little bit cooler. So let's have our skin like so. Let's think about what will be the shirt of the character, also on the cooler side of the spectrum. And the bottom portion of the figure now will be a little bit different, will be still dark, but on the cooler side of the spectrum. So let's make it like this. And now let's paint a color accent on the top of the character. And now I'm going to choose the warmer and bright orange for the detail. It's just a color accent. And now we have our cool color scheme in place. All three of them are really effective. You must, however, make up your mind as to what kind of objective you have in mind when creating your character. What kind of feel do you want to convey to your players? So let's lock the layer and let's create a new one. And this time let's make things a little bit different in our color scheme. So I'm going to control click the thumbnail to make my selection. And again, I'm moving my selection to the side. Make sure you're painting on the right layer. And this time, let's try to have more contrast in our color scheme. So to begin with, I'll select the more vibrant skin tone, this one, and I'll just paint over the area corresponding to the skin, this one actually. Okay. Let's go with the brighter color for the hair. Now let's try a little bit more of a neutral contrasting color because it's cooler for the upper portion of the clothes. Now let's try a vibrant color instead of this gray. Remember that this time we're seeking to have the biggest possible contrast. And let's use the cooler, darker color for the bottom of our character. And now we can choose a color for the details. Since everything is so saturated, we can have a neutral color for the detail on our character. And you can see, again, it's pretty much a matter of establishing an objective for your character, but all four color schemes may work depending on the needs of your project. Okay? So think about this. Think about what does your character need to be effective? What are the colors that go behind the character in the environment? What kind of colors is he or she going to be seen against? Take all this into consideration and then decide on the better colors to design your character. Experiment with simple color schemes such as the ones shown in this video, and above everything, have fun. So thanks for watching, and I see you all in the next video.
In this video, I'll show you how to simplify the character creation process by using just 4 colors. Hi there, Andrew here. In previous videos, we were working with relatively simple shapes and objects. Characters are many simple shapes just added together. Where the other projects were concerned with tiling, here we care mostly about the silhouette, color, and detail in that order. Open a new document with a size of 64 pixels by 64 pixels. This is more space than we need for our character, but it'll give us plenty of room to animate the character later. Older systems like the Game Boy only had 4 colors to work with and still managed to create memorable characters. By starting with a limited 4-color palette, we can focus more on contrast and areas of interest for our character before we start adding colors and details. This will make sure we are focusing on what matters, our form, without getting distracted by choosing and shading the right colors. The most important feature of any character is their silhouette. It's how we determine what we're looking at in an often busy game scene. Because of this, I'm starting with a single black color to block out most of my character. I'm trying to make sure that the shapes here reflect the concept Ricardo sketched out in a previous video, while still adhering to our limited pixel size. Once I'm satisfied with the silhouette, it's time to add some contrast. By using white and a light and dark gray, I can block out areas in my character where clothing, skin, hair, leather, and metal will be. By alternating the light and dark gray areas of the body, I can create contrast that will make the character's details easier to pick out. Even though the eyes are just a few pixels, the large contrast between white and black help them pop out from the figure. By being smart about where we keep the highest and lowest contrast areas, we can make just a few pixels work for fine details. I'm keeping a strong outline for the character. This will make the animations easier to pick out, and the main character should be the highest contrast object in the scene anyway. In the next video, I'll show you how to bring color to our character. In this video, I'll be showing you how to take our black and white block in, add color, and then add shading. Hi there, Andrew here. Now that the character is blocked in, we can start adding colors. Just like in previous videos, I'm starting with the mid-tone for each area. I'm keeping the outlines in black for now, but we'll replace them with dark colors later during the shading process. Just like I shaded the other objects in the series, I'm applying a shadow, imagining a light coming from the upper left, using just a few pixels here and there to give the impression that light is wrapping around a three-dimensional form. The process here is an iterative one. As I fill in color and add shadows and highlights, I'll make adjustments to the shape of the character. Always pay attention to your preview window. Looking up close to your pixel art will make placing colors easier, but it's the game-sized view that we care about. In the next video, we'll add some finishing touches to the character and give her a signature weapon.
Hi everyone. In this section, we're going to talk about the brush tool. You can select the brush tool by hitting the letter B on your keyboard or by selecting the brush icon on your toolbar. In case your brush is not showing, just click and hold at the brush icon and select the brush tool from the drop-down menu. So, brushes are used to create marks on your file, which are also commonly referred to as paint on your canvas. So that's what we call digital painting, okay? In this case, we have a brush with a hard edge and some texture applied to it. But if we select another brush, we have another tip, which is also hard, but without any texture applied. We can also have different shapes for the tip of our brushes. And this one, for example, responds to pen pressure. So it's a little bit more dynamic and with a square shape. We also have what we call the airbrush, which is soft on its entirety and it doesn't have any hard edges. So there are many different kinds of marks you can create, but we can customize it even more. If we go to Window, Brush, or by hitting F5 on your keyboard, you open the Brushes window, which is this one you're looking at. If you go to Brush Tip Shape, you have access to all of your brushes and ways to customize them. So let's take a look first on how to customize the tip of our brush. If we change the spacing, we can see that every brush stroke is composed of tiny dots, which are more or less spaced. So you can change the spacing and change the way your brush stroke behaves. For example, I can create a more noisy brush stroke if I increase the spacing, and a more even brush stroke if I decrease the spacing. There is also hardness. Hardness will create a hard edge even on soft brushes, so I can control how hard or how soft I want my brush strokes by changing the slider right or left. Okay? Now let's take a look at the angle control, which is this tiny square with the circle inside. If I change the handles, I can squeeze my brush stroke and have a different kind of mark, but also I can change the angle and have a more chiseled-like shape in my brush stroke. Let's move it back to its original shape. And of course, I can change the size of my brush by moving the size slider right or left, and I can have a bigger or smaller brush. Okay? And I can do this for every single brush I have saved in Photoshop. So these are lots and lots of options for mark making, for painting with different brushes. And also, besides all this, I have these options on the left that control even more the way painting is applied in Photoshop. So let's close this window and take a look at another option to customize your brush. You can right click and then you have this window if your brush is selected, and you have access to all of your brushes. And also, the last brushes you used will be over here. And right above it, you have some controls for the tip of your brush. You have controls such as the ones we've seen before, angle and squeezing, and you also have hardness and size of your brush. Okay? All this just by right clicking, and you have a lot of control over your brush. So now it's time to start thinking about color application. Color is a very interesting topic, and we are going to see it in our next lesson.
In this video, we'll be finishing our character by adding form that exists behind our character's back. Hi there, Andrew here. I've chosen to ignore the further arm up until this point, but now it's time to include it and our character's signature anchor weapon. Create a new layer under our character. Since the arm is behind our pirate, we can place a whole arm on a lower layer. Here I'm using temporary colors to block in the arm and the anchor. This is a technique I'll be making extensive use of later when we animate. Like when we first started the character, we want to create strong silhouette first and then add color and detail later. By creating different colors for the arm and anchor, they'll be easy to distinguish from each other. Once the basic shape looks good, start coloring and shading the arm to match the closer arm. Then I start drawing out the anchor. By drawing out our pixels in a sequence like this, we can make sure that the anchor has a nice, mechanical looking curve to it. Once this is done, your character is ready to animate. In the next video, I'll be taking a look at some of the enemies I've created for this project, and how we can use their shapes and poses to tell the player how they're going to act. In this video, I will show you how to apply our knowledge of shape language to create enemies for our game. Hi there, Andrew here. While creating the enemies uses the same process as creating our main character, different things need to be taken into consideration. For the player, the most important thing to know about an enemy is how it will harm or attack the player. While the player will learn from experience, good character design means making the purpose of each enemy obvious. The shark is meant to jump out of the water and threaten any player who gets too close. The direction the shark can and will move is clear from the shape and direction the shark is pointed. The shark is essentially a column. If you were playing a game with this enemy in it, you would be surprised if the shark leapt suddenly to the left or right. Instead, the design not only uses triangles to indicate a threatening nature, but the orientation of those triangles make it clear what the shark will do from the very first time you see it. The bird is similarly oriented to move left and right across the screen. We know birds fly, so we expect the bird to attack that way. But the inverted triangle of the bird gives a sense of speed and imbalance, indicating this is an enemy that will attack quickly and from above. The skeleton is a trapezoid, making it feel like a barrier or obstacle to overcome. We get the sense that this character would hold his ground and then lunge at us suddenly. The silhouette of this character highlights the drawn and prepared sword, showing us in one direction the skeleton is likely to attack. This wraps up week 3. You could take the new techniques you've learned here, combined with the art skills you've been building so far to create more enemies, characters, environments, or props for your scene. Next week we'll be finishing up this module by learning how to animate for pixel art.
Hi everyone, in this lesson we're going to take a brief looking at storyboarding and how to plan the action for your character. So let's take a look first at the attack sequence for our character. The best approach is to first roughly sketch the middle action of your sequence. For example, if she's going to swing her anchor to attack, we can roughly sketch the middle frame and then what comes before and after that specific action, okay? So you can see that there is a pretty slow movement from 1 to 2. So it's a pretty slow movement from the first frame to the second frame. And on the third frame, since the action is more extreme, we can use a graphic element such as an arrow to indicate that the movement is much faster than what came before. In this way, you have frames 1, 2, and 3 showing exactly what's the attack movement of your character will be. And you can see that this doesn't require any sort of detailed sketch. It's just like a rough idea. Okay, let's take a look now at the walk cycle. The movement of the walk cycle can be also indicated by an arrow, and this works as a reminder for whoever is working in production with you that the direction to which the character moves is correct. Okay, and now let's take a look on how we can animate this walking cycle so we have a smooth movement for our character. So let's use our dummy here, and you can see that I actually captured the middle of the motion, which means it's the middle of the walking cycle. The best way to do that, as we've seen with our previous sketch, is working with the extremes. So let's add to this cycle the first movement and the last movement. And you can see that they are pretty much a repetition of the same middle movement. But notice that we changed the position of the arms and legs, and the first frame and the last frame are the same. Okay, so now all we have to do is begin adding intermediate frames, intermediate movements to our character to have a complete walking cycle. So let's do this now. Let's begin by placing the intermediate frames so you can see that there's a flow in the movement. So I'm going to turn in the intermediate movements between the first and the second and the third. And now we have 5 frames that shows the movement in a much better way. And you can see their heads are at the same line. But we can have even more movement if we introduce intermediate frames to these ones. So let's introduce another frame here. And let's introduce another one here. And now you can see that there's an arc of movement on the head of the character that makes him feel more lively. And let's continue introducing intermediate frames here. And you can see that there's a follow-up in the movement. So we can now feel that character moves up and down as well as forward. Okay? We have 9 frames here. And you can see that the first one and the last one are the same. So let's see how it plays if we actually have this as an animation. We can have this as a separate layer here. Okay? And let's see if we superimpose our frames, if the animation plays in the right way. Pay a lot of attention to the position of the arms and the legs, as some frames they repeat themselves, but the arms and legs are actually in opposite positions, okay? So now we have a fine movement for our character with a smooth animation and a nice walking cycle, okay? Try this exercise so you can have a good feel of the movement and actions of your character. Thanks for watching, and I see you all in the next video.
In this video, I'll show you how to create a simple gem shimmer animation. Hi there, Andrew here. Today we're going to get our feet wet animating by doing a simple reflection wipe across these basic gems. By starting with something so simple, we can focus on our setup and workflow, so when we start doing more complex animations like walks and runs, we can pay more attention to expressions and poses. The core of animating in Photoshop is the timeline. We can open it by going to Window, Timeline. The timeline will pop up at the bottom of our window. It starts with only 4 frames. They're currently all the same because we haven't made any changes yet. The frames can keep track of positions and the visibility of our layers, but not their contents. We can't animate the changes to the actual pixels of each layer, but by changing which layers are and aren't showing, we can create the illusion of motion. Start creating layers over top of our basic gem. The reflection will happen over 8 frames, so we will need to create 7 new layers. Name them 2 through 8 so they're easier to keep track of. On frame 2, we will paint just a hint of white reflection in the upper right hand corner of the gem. Turn off layers 3 through 8. If we drag the timeline slider back and forth, we can see that it will show without the shine, then the glint. Add a new frame. Select layer 3 and hide the others. Here we will add a larger and stronger glint of reflection. Keep going new frame by new layer until we have a full white reflection at the very end. To preview the effect, set the playback speed to 0.01 on every frame and press play. We can see the glint move across the gem before looping. Repeat for the other gems. In the next video, we will apply these same techniques to animating our game character. In this video, you will learn how to take your pixel character and start creating animations with it. To start animating our character, open a duplicate of your finished pixel art character from week 3. Let's apply the basic workflow from last lesson with a more complex setting, like our main figure. We want to create a simple idle animation so that while she is standing still, she still demonstrates a sense of character and life. The animation timeline will allow me to move the layers into position on one of 2 keyframes. We want the character bobbing up and down, suggesting the way a person will shift their weight while standing. Create a second keyframe and duplicate the body layer. Then lower the position of the back arm and anchor, which should have already been separated from the last video. Then I take my rectangular selection tool by pressing the M key and select the top of the body right up to the boots. By lowering the body like we did the anchor, we make the whole body bob up and down, but it looks like our character is getting squished rather than they're being relaxed. Using selection tools, I move parts of the legs so it looks like the knee is bending, and then I fill in the gaps with the pencil tool. I work back and forth between the two frames, making sure features line up properly. You can always add more keys or movement in the arms to give more life and detail into the animation, but I want to keep things simple. Save your animation as a copy and rename it something like idle or character idle. In the next video, I'll show you how to create a more complex pose with your character to create more advanced animations. In this video, I will show you how to create an animated 4-frame run cycle. Hi there, Andrew here. Now that we're feeling more comfortable animating poses for our character, we can create a run cycle. Anytime we need an animation to loop seamlessly, we call it a cycle. My character's standing pose will simply not work for a run animation. We need the balance and weight to press forward to be believable. By hiding everything but the stick figures, I can play a simple 2-frame animation to check the readability of my poses. First, I create 2 new frames and start using a green pencil to draw simple stick figures. These are guides as to how my character needs to be posed and will help me check my animation before the time-consuming process of creating the whole figure. As soon as they look good, it's time to turn them into full poses. By pressing the C key, I can gain access to the crop tool. This will let me expand my canvas further to the right, where I can place my original character pose for reference while I work. I could always bring this up as another window, or I could have it on a second monitor, but here it's a little clearer where I'm pulling my colors from, and also helps you see that I'm matching the final poses to my original character standing pose. Select the head on the body layer with the lasso tool and copy it. Then paste a copy on both of the running poses. You're going to have to paste it straight onto the layer that they're part of. Since the head won't change shape while our character runs, it's a good place to start. With the green lines as my guide, I recreate the character in this new pose. I start by blocking in just the color. I want to make sure the silhouette works before moving on to detail. Do the same with the second pose. Position the back arm and the anchor, paying attention to where the back shoulder should be. When both poses are done, we can check the animation. But here a new problem appears. It's clear that only one leg is moving forward. We will need 2 more frames and 2 more poses to show that the back leg also steps forward. Create a duplicate of each running pose layer and 2 more timeline keyframes. Once we have the correct layer showing on each keyframe, all we have to do is change a few pixels to show the opposite leg is forward. Then position the front arm forward. Remember when we are walking or running, if a leg is back, the arm on the same side is forward, and vice versa. Reposition the back arm and anchor just like we did when we were posing it on the other 2 frames. This is how we're going to demonstrate our sense of balance. Polish up these poses and play back our result. Now we have a simple but convincing run animation. If we want to take this animation to the next level, You might want to animate the hair bobbing up and down, or add one more key in between each of the existing keys to bring the total number up to 8 frames. But even with just these 4, it's more than enough for a classic SNES style run cycle. In the last video, I will show you how to take all of these animations and place them on a single sprite sheet for easy importing into Unity. In this video, I will demonstrate a few tricks to create a more complex pose for pixel animation. Hi there, Andrew here. In the last video, you made a pixel character idle animation. It wasn't too complex because the character didn't move very much. Today we will work to create a more extreme change in pose by making a jump animation. While we will get to more complex multi-frame animations in our next video, I want you to start with these simpler ones first to get comfortable with posing and animating. Start with a duplicate of our finished pixel character and create a duplicate of the body layer. I start by drawing out a few guidelines in this bright green color. It helps me decide how I want to pose the character. I chose this color simply because it wasn't present otherwise on my character. It makes it easy to pick out. I take the front leg and erase most of it, recreating it in a bent pose. I want the character to look like she's in the air, but is ready to land at any moment, because I don't know how long the character will be jumping for. Then I take the back leg and I do the same thing. This leg comes up higher and behind the first leg. Creating the right silhouette here is more important than being able to see both legs in this case. Next, I draw my attention to the front arm. I'm using the lasso select tool to reposition the arm off to the side. This makes it easier to pose the arm just by itself. Using the same tools and techniques I applied to the leg, I want to position the arm in a bent pose. Putting the arm back into place, we can see there's a problem with the upper pose of the body. In this case, the whole upper body looks way too relaxed. We want a sense of forward movement. Start by moving the head forward, and then redraw the neck to match. When we have finished, we will pitch the whole upper body forward. The goal here is to give the character a sense of balance in the middle of their jump, but there's also a little hint of forward momentum. Create a second keyframe and place the second frame up in the air. Give the animation a few test plays to check it out in our second window to make sure the final result reads well. Now I'm happy with the pose. Polish up the shading on the jumping pose to match up better with the standing pose. Lastly, I'm going to move the braid and the hair a little bit down. These little subtle changes in a pose help to sell that an object isn't stiff or rigid. In the next video, I will show you how to take what we've learned so far and apply it to a multi-frame run cycle animation.